So one more announcement I wanted to share along the lines of Sabbath Sunday here in a couple weeks. One of the things that we take very seriously here, we've done a series on in the past, is Sabbath rest and the importance of taking time to stop, to rest, to delight, and to worship. And so we ask all of our staff to take a weekly Sabbath. We really encourage that, want to make space for that. We do this twice a year as a church where we take 2 Sundays for this. But another thing that we do is we ask all of our staff every 2 years to take a month-long sabbatical, and just as a way of communicating the priority of that rest. And so it's my turn, which I'm super excited about, and so tomorrow I will begin my sabbatical through July 26th. So wanted to let you guys know that in case you send me an email and don't get it back. That's what's going on, but also for you to know that our team is still hard at work. If there's anything that you need, they are still here for you, and just grateful for a community that understands the importance of this rest for their staff. So thank you guys for making that possible. As we get started this morning, I wanted to start by sharing one of my favorite Christmas movies. Here we are in June. It makes sense to talk about Christmas movies. But one of my favorite Christmas movies is Christmas Vacation. Anybody else? Yes. Classic, 1989, hilarious. For those that don't know, which honestly, I find myself surprised every year by the number of people that have I've never seen that movie. I'm like, what planet are you from? But it stars Chevy Chase, who is this kind of family man who is hosting the old-fashioned family Christmas. And he's bringing all of his family into his house to stay for the Christmas season. But kind of in the background, the other thing that's going on is Chevy Chase's character, Clark Griswold, works at a cereal corporation. And he is waiting on his bonus check to come through. And it's not coming through, and he's getting anxious about it because he is going to surprise his family by putting in an in-ground pool. And so he keeps waiting for this check to come. And finally, we get to Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve comes around, and kind of in the mix of the comedy of errors and all the things that are already going wrong, the mailman shows up at his door and hands him an envelope. And he says, "This fell between the seats. I'm so sorry." So it explains why he hasn't gotten his bonus check. But Clark Griswold takes this check and he goes back into the living room and kind of begins this big speech about how he's really sorry for being in such a bad mood. He's just been waiting on this bonus check to come because he's putting in an in-ground pool. Everybody cheers, and he's like, and if there's enough left over, I'm going to fly everybody in. We're going to celebrate. And then he opens the envelope. And he just stares at it, kind of like, what do I do with this? And you're kind of like waiting, is it more than he thought it was? What is it? And begins to walk around. Finally, he announces that the bonus this year is a Jelly of the Month Club subscription. To which Cousin Eddie, our favorite character, right, is like, well, Clark, it's the gift that gives the whole year round. It's like, that it is, Eddie, that it is. And then his cousin Eddie goes and kidnaps Clark's boss on Christmas Eve, brings him to Clark's house. And what we come to find out is that the boss has cut bonuses this year in the interest of having a better looking bottom line. And the boss's kind of line is that a bottom line feels good until you see the people that it hurts. Clark Griswold's like, you know what? If you don't want to give bonuses, fine, but when people expect them as a part of their income, it's kind of messed up not to give that. Now, I want to be clear, Clark Griswold was not struggling economically. But we do have a similar kind of thing happening in James this week with a community of people who are being oppressed by the rich members of the society. And in particular, having things like wages withheld that are rightfully theirs. And so what we're going to see this week is, again, this theme of the wealth disparity and the oppression of the poor by the rich. It's clear that James's community is a lower economic community that have suffered immensely under the unjust treatment of those who had the power to do that. And what we see even in this passage is that they were even leveraging the courts to conduct such oppression legally. And so James begins this by making some accusations, some charges against who he calls the rich. And we don't get a lot about who these people are beyond just this description of the rich, those with an abundance. But his charges include hoarding wealth, that they've stored up treasure when they should have been making good use of it, And not only that, but they did so at the expense of those who not only needed it, but had earned it rightly. We're not even talking about a handout here. We're just talking about paying people the wages that they had rightly earned. And so James, in the second half of this, kind of tells his community what their response to this should be. He encourages them to be patient for God's justice, to wait for God's justice, to strengthen their hearts, to not complain about one another. And he calls on the prophets as an example to look to of enduring suffering. He encourages them to count on the Lord's mercy and compassion. And then above all, he tells them not to make oaths. And it seems to be in the context of this, what he's referring to is promising to pay back money that they're not going to be able to pay back, or to make good on debts that they're not going to be able to make good on. Because worse than the oppression that they're receiving is for them to be dishonest in return. And so what we see in this passage is James has these two audiences that he's addressing: the rich and then the oppressed brothers and sisters of his community. And we look at the Greek language, and what we see is it seems that the way that James is speaking to the rich, he's speaking to them as people who are not currently in the room. Meaning he's not speaking to them directly. He's kind of calling them out among his community who are those who are oppressed. And he's speaking directly to this other part, the oppressed, the brothers and sisters who are actually in the room. If we think about this passage this morning, we face a sort of opposite problem, where based on the demographics of our church and our community, many of us who are in the room here are wealthy by the world's standards, and the oppressed are out there. And you may hear that as strange. It may sound uncomfortable to hear. One statistic says that if you have an annual income of $30,000 or more, you are in the world's top 1% of earners, which, I recognize there's cost of living in there, all of that, but I think we have to be careful to exempt ourselves from those that James is speaking to in this passage. As a result, though, what happens oftentimes in some middle and more upper-class congregations is there's a tendency to spiritualize this passage, to make it a passage that's more about a lesson on enduring suffering as the righteous ones, that we are the righteous ones who have been oppressed. And it's easy to take a verse like verses 6 and 7 and use it for that end. He says, "You have condemned, you have murdered the righteous who does not resist you. Therefore, brothers and sisters, be patient until the Lord's coming." Could be easy to take this message, just be patient. The Lord will repay their injustice against your righteousness. But I think this reading of Scripture is more to exempt us from the very thing that James is trying to address, which is our participation in a system that rewards the wealthy at the expense of those most in need. It's a reading of Scripture that allows us to feel good about ourselves, or at least not feel bad, if we can just reposition ourselves from the materially wealthy in the passage to the spiritually oppressed in the passage. And so I want to be clear that I think this kind of spiritualizing of Scripture soothes our conscience in the short run, but fuels the hypocrisy of the church in the long run. And so this morning, I don't want to talk about enduring material oppression today as if that were the most relevant message to us in this room. But I want to speak to James's indictment and what we might learn from it about the stewardship of our resources. James opens the passage on this announcement of miseries that are coming on those with abundance. Verse 1, he says, "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail over the miseries that are coming on you." You read that and you're like, James, man, you're a bit harsh. Little strong language here. Why? Why is he bringing this strong language? Well, verse 2, it says, "Your wealth has rotted, your clothes are moth-eaten, your gold and silver are corroded." Their wealth is rotted, clothes are moth-eaten, their gold and silver is corroded. I want to ask, what do all of these images have in common? Of rot, of moth-eaten, of corrosion. All of these things are things that happen to objects that sit unused. When I was a kid, I remember very clearly the bedroom that I had when I was growing up had 2 closets in it. One closet had all of my clothes and my stuff in it, and then the other closet had some of my parents' clothes where they were kind of keeping them. And this closet where my parents had clothes, whenever I would open it up, the smell of mothballs would hit me in the face. Anybody know what I'm talking about? That distinct smell that I cannot get out of my head no matter how long it's been. And I remember as a kid thinking like, okay, I don't fully understand what this means. Like moths are going to fly in and they're just going to eat these clothes. Like what exactly is going to happen? I don't know. But in any case, the point is moths do not eat clothes that you're actively wearing. They eat clothes that you have stored, that you have stockpiled, that you put in the closet 15 years ago and you forgot you had. Another thing that we did as kids with my dad is we would restore antique tractors. And so we would go out into the woods and we would find these old tractors that had been sitting in there for decades and they would be rusted. Some of them had trees growing through the axle of them. It was crazy, but then we would take those and we would restore them, but they were rusted because they sat there unused. When something rots, it means there's wood that's not been put to good use. What James is condemning here is the wasteful storage of excess. Reminds me of Jesus' words in Matthew 6. He says, "Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Reminds me of a story Jesus tells where 2 men come to him, or one man comes to him telling him to make his brother share the inheritance with him. And Jesus is kind of like, why are you bringing me into this? This is not mine to handle. But Jesus takes this as an opportunity to teach. And so he says, your life does not consist in the abundance of things. And goes on to tell them this parable of the rich fool. The rich fool is a farmer who has this season where he has incredible harvest, but does not have enough barn space to store all of it. So he tears down his current barns and builds new ones. And thinks, I have much to take care of me. I can rest and live out my days easily. And God says, you fool, today your life will be demanded of you. Kind of making the point, what good is having these barns full of stuff if you're not going to leverage it for something more? This story reminds me of some convicting stats on storage units in America. Did you know that there are currently 2.1 billion square feet of storage unit space in America? The math on that, what that comes out to is 6.3 square feet of storage space for every single person in the United States. Not just the people that rent the space, every single person in the United States. Now, there's plenty of good reasons to have storage units. I'm not calling anybody out here. But I do wonder sometimes if maybe this should, when we go to get a storage unit or maybe another storage unit, we should maybe consider getting rid of some stuff. All right, especially given that sometimes what ends up happening is we put it in there until we die and then our kids have to rummage through it, right? Maybe there's some excess stuff we could get rid of. James goes on and he says, "And their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have stored up treasure in the last days." So he says the corrosion of their gold and silver will be a witness against them. James is setting up a quite convicting and I would say even comical courtroom scene here. All right, I want you to imagine with me for a second. The courtroom scene is that the rich are on trial. and the prosecuting attorney brings the rich person's corroded pile of gold onto the stand. And the question is, hey, corroded pile of gold, were you put to good use? To which the corroded gold responds, well, just look at me. I'm corroded in rust. What do you think? It's going to testify against them. And so Jesus' condemnation, or James's condemnation here, is not of wealth itself, but wealth that is not put to good use for eternal purposes, for kingdom purposes, for God's purposes. He goes on to say that you have stored up treasure in the last days. The last days of what? What is James talking about here? Well, there's a few possibilities. There's one that's the possibility that Jesus is coming back at any point, so why save anything at all? Another option is that they are living in the end times, and even if I die, we got 50 years tops before Jesus comes back, right? But I think there's a third option that might be kind of the most helpful way to think about this. And that is when we look at God's work in history, it can be sort of divided up into four sort of eras. And I've put this on a slide for you here. The first era would be creation, when God creates humanity, creates his creation. But then the second era would be the fall, where humanity is living in the fallenness of our existence. And then the third era would be redemption. This is when Jesus comes in the incarnation. He overcomes evil and sin and death. And then the fourth era would be recreation. This is what we are waiting on. It's the recreation of the heavens and the earth. And so by last days, what we're talking about is we are living in that period between redemption and recreation. And what we are invited to as God's people in this last days is to participate in the recreation of the heavens and the earth. Not that we bring it about by our own power, but that God now is inviting us to participate in the ushering in of that recreation, even as we wait for God's full work of recreation. Maybe to paint this picture a little more practically for you, occasionally I will be working on a project around the house, maybe some painting, maybe mowing the yard, and my kids will come and want to participate. Or maybe I'll just invite them to participate in this. And truth be told, it would probably go a lot faster, be a lot neater if I did it myself. But by allowing them participate in it, it is both teaching them, it's forming them, it's inviting them into the work. We get to spend time together and connect. And so as God's people, God is inviting us into this recreation work. It's not that God needs us. He could do this just as well without us, but he's inviting us into it because it's a part of our formation. In other words, what James is getting at is we have more important things to do with our resources than stockpiling. And so at this point, James makes a simple plea. And his simple plea is to do justice. You see here, he's saying, I'm not even talking about lofty things like handouts and giving things away. I'm just talking about giving people what is rightfully theirs. Verse 4, he says, look, the pay that you withheld from the workers who mowed your fields cries out. And the outcry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. If we go back to our courtroom scene with the corroded wealth on the stand, what the picture is here is a small piece of that wealth kind of breaks off, and for some reason I see this like declaring in a high-pitched voice, yeah, we weren't even supposed to be here. We belong to the workers who mowed the field. They have withheld the wages of those who rightfully deserved them. The evil of their hoarding was that they not only hoarded their own, but they also withheld what little pay others had worked for, and it was all that they had to live on. And so James continues, he says, you have lived luxuriously on the earth, have indulged yourselves, you have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter, you have condemned, you have murdered the righteous who does not resist you. Explains that they've lived luxuriously and indulged themselves while depriving others of wages to meet their basic needs. They've condemned, they've murdered those who have done no wrong against them. In verse 6 there, James uses the word condemned, and a lot of scholars believe that James is making specific reference to a court decision, condemned in the context of the legal system. In other words, it's likely that the rich had used the legal system to deprive the poor of their wages and land, and therefore many of them ended up in prison, and some of them even dying there. This is what James is referring to by saying that they had murdered them. But this is the kind of murder that's easy for them to distance themselves from. To say, I didn't murder them. That was just the verdict of the courts. Never mind the fact that they may have bribed the courts or just used them to their own advantage. And so what I would say here is, I think as God's people bent on seeing God's justice done, we have to be careful about allowing the outcomes of our human legal systems to lead us to feel exempt from the justice of God. The other thing that we see here is a revelation of who the rich's God is. The rich people that James is talking about here. Who's the one that they ultimately depend on? And one of the things that I want to say here that's helpful in determining this is when it comes to kind of our worship of money versus our worship of God, one of the things that can be helpful in determining what we worship is that when we worship money, money is the end and people are the means. They are the means to that end. They are the ones that I can walk all over, that I can take advantage of, that I can manipulate, that I can leverage for the end of more money. But when we rightly understand the gospel, when we worship God, people become the end, and money is one of the means to loving God's people, to taking care of God's people, to bringing justice for God's people. And so if we understand and believe the gospel, the message that Jesus gave it all for us, what that means is that we can also live with the confidence that if he gave his life for us, we can count on it that he has not forgotten us now. That we can begin to live in the freedom of not depending on our own resources at every moment, living in the fear and the anxiety of that, but the freedom to leverage our resources for eternal purposes because we know that this God is with us, that he has not forsaken us. And so my question for you all this morning, the big question that I want you to wrestle with, to take home, to ponder on is this. Are you putting your resources to work for God's purposes? Are you putting your resources to work for kingdom purposes, for eternal purposes? This can look a lot of different ways. One of the things that we say here a lot is we want to know what it is that you're passionate about. What are the things that break your heart? And how do we as the church come around you and help you pursue transformation in that area? How do we as the community of God's people come together and link arms knowing that we can do more together than we can as individuals? Maybe this looks like funding care for the homeless or funding efforts for justice, funding efforts of the church or funding missionaries or funding orphanage or care for the marginalized. Are we leveraging our resources for God's purposes? Maybe to help you think about this a little bit, I recently read a book called The Opposite of Spoiled: Raising Kids Who Are Grounded, Generous, and Smart About Money. And in this book, he's talking about this father who is trying to teach his kids about making financial decisions and using principles for making those financial decisions. So what this father does is 1 month he cashes his entire paycheck and he brings it home and with his kids kind of lays out where that money goes. And so he says this much goes towards giving or tithing, this much goes towards the mortgage, this much goes towards utilities, this much towards food, and kind of lays out for them where the money goes so that they understand that if you do not prioritize things, you're going to not have the funds for the things that you really need. Trying to teach them that we have to make financial choices, and you make those based on financial priorities. Meaning, if I were to decide I'm going to go spend all of my money at Frankie's Fun Park, but I'm not going to feed my children, you might wonder if my priorities are backwards. Is something off here? And so the point of this is to say, where we put our money reveals what we value. What we do with our money tells a story about what we value. If that's the case, I want to ask, what's the story that your money tells about what you value? Now, I want to be clear, this is not a guilt thing. James is simply putting the challenge to us of whether we are leveraging our resources for treasures that will not rust and cannot be destroyed by moths. Where do we start? What's your next step? How do you begin to take steps towards leveraging your resources? In order to make this very practical for you, I wanted to kind of show you something that I consider kind of a stages of giving. And I want to invite you to just begin reflect on kind of where you are currently and to know that so much of this is not about giving just to give something away, but there's a freedom piece to this. Do you have the freedom with your resources emotionally to say, I'm going to depend on God more than my own ability to provide for myself. I want to leverage this for something more than myself. And so maybe if you're here this morning, maybe you're not giving anything, not just to church, but to any sort of charity or nonprofit organization. And if that's the case, my invitation for you this morning is just to give something. To begin to give something so that you can begin to experience the joy of generosity, but also the freedom that comes with that. Maybe you're here this morning and you've given something that you give on an occasional basis when you're able, when there's some excess. If that's you, my invitation would be to give consistently, to go from giving something to giving consistently. If you're here this morning and you're giving consistently, it's a regular thing that you do, my invitation for you is to begin to give significantly. That maybe you're giving on a regular basis, but it's not a significant amount. And I want to challenge you, I want to invite you to give significantly. And then maybe that's you this morning. You are in a place where you are giving consistently and significantly. But the place where we are all invited to as followers of Jesus is to give sacrificially. To give until it hurts. And I wanted to take a step beyond just this to say, I want to give you an opportunity to take that step right now. One of the partner organizations that we work with is Housing for New Hope. This is an organization that works with the homeless to find housing and to find sustainable housing. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to give you an opportunity now to scan this QR code and to give to Housing for New Hope. That 100% of whatever you give between now and noon is going to go straight to Housing for New Hope. We are not keeping any of this because we want it to be clear this is not about Bright City. This is about you getting to experience the joy of generosity, of living free of the worship of our resources. I realize for some of us this morning, this is a struggle. It's a struggle to not depend on our own resources more than we depend on God. I want to create some space now. I want to invite you to just bow your head. We're going to have our prayer team available on the sides. Maybe you're just really wrestling with this morning. God, I want to depend on you, but it's just too hard. I'm too afraid. I want to invite you to wrestle with these stages wherever you are. What does it look like for you to act in faith and trust right now? I'm just going to spend some time in prayer, and if maybe you need prayer for something not related to this, our prayer team is here. We're here to pray for you. We want to create some space for that. But let's just spend some time in God's presence now as we prepare for communion together.